It's always a real treat when you see the King's Indian defence on the board at the elite level of chess. So you don't often see it played, but it's a very fighting, attacking weapon, leads to complex, sharp positions, and that's why Alireza selected to play it today against Bogdan Daniel Deac, a 2670 odd GM, so a guy he's looking to beat. So Deac kicked off with pawn d4 here, Alireza went knight to f6, we had pawn c4, pawn g6, the knight came to c3, and now bishop g7 allows white to set up the big centre with e4, black goes d6, all very standard stuff, and now this bishop comes to e2. The absolute main line there is bringing the knight to f3, but we'll see that Deac's going for a trendy topical line. So after Alireza castles, he goes pawn h4, very aggressive stuff. Now I've seen this quite a bit recently. Hikaru covered a couple of games on his channels. He faced this in recent tournaments. Now c5 is a very common response. After white goes d5, black often goes e6, opens the e-file. But what Alireza does here is go knight to c6. So a much rarer move. He's very much going his own way already. Now it runs straight into d5, which Deac played. The knight finds a home on e5. Now f4 is no good, by the way, or the knight then finds a home on g4. You're just weakening your position too much. So here the move pawn h5 was played, kicking on with that kingside expansion, and Alireza goes pawn c6. He strikes in the centre, standard thematic counter to a flank attack. And it might look most logical here for white to actually capture the g-pawn, open the h-file for the rook, but actually pawn h6 was played. A very different way of playing, very Alpha Zero-esque. So the bishop drops back to h8, and basically white is just arguing, okay, I'm cramping your pieces, that pawn can create mating threats later on, I've got the space, I'm better in this position, and the engines love it. Sure enough, they're happy with the white position. So Deac goes knight to f3 here, and the way the computer wants to play is simply taking this one, bishop recaptures, knight d7, you've now vacated e5 for the other knight, you've opened your bishop, and so on. But what Alireza does here is go knight into g4, and he's basically trying to complicate the position, keep pieces on the board, and already here actually white doesn't play in the most accurate way. So castles was played first, that move is fine, then Alireza goes queen b6, looking to mix it up against b2, this f2 pawn here, and the best way for white to respond is actually going pawn a4, say then black goes pawn a5 in response. Well, you can drop this knight back to e1, you open up your bishop to attack g4, just kind of slow play the position, trust the fact that you've got more space. This is kind of just smoke and mirrors, this attack on the king side. But what Bogdan does here is go queen b3. Now it's not a bad move at all, but he's looking to just play very solid. You know, he's treading carefully against Alireza. Now neither player wants to swap the queens here on the file. Then you open the a file for the rook. So Alireza went knight to h5. He's looking to hop into g3 here, use the pin on this pawn, and so knight h2 was played, a good move, opening up this bishop, so you don't have time to go knight g3, or then you lose this one here. This is no good, white simply ahead, 2- for the rook. So after this knight came to h5, knight h2, Alireza actually dropped back, and here knight f3 was played. So Deac's actually inviting a repeat of moves. He just wants a draw, but Alireza's having none of it. He goes knight d7. So now he's looking to go knight c5, hit the queen. It dropped back into c2 here, and now the knight came to c5, a beautiful square, pressuring e4. You can't go b4 yet, the queen's holding that square, plus there's tactical issues down here. So bishop f4 was played, standard developing move. a5 now from Firouzja, he clamps on that b4 square, and the rook swung all the way over to e1. Someday white wants to get e5 if possible, but this f rook stays here, just holding the f2 pawn. And now Alireza could play more simply here with bishop d7 or pawn a4, you know, steady on the position, but white does have the space, and you have to be a bit careful. Alireza strikes with f5, and if he hadn't have done that on this move, then white gets bishop d1, and with the rook opened up, then white could go e5 in response. But you can't do that in this position. The bishop blocks the rook, and so pawn takes is the best move. That's what was played, and bishop recaptures looks the most logical. You hit the queen, then it comes to d2, but Alireza didn't do this. He took with the rook. And again, basically, he's trying to complicate the position. Deac was very low on the clock now already, almost playing on increment. He gets in crazy time trouble. So Alireza took with the rook, asked the bishop what it wants to do. It came to g5 here, looks at e7, also continues to hold this h6 pawn. Don't forget that is attacked by the knight. And now the queen came to d8. Good move from Alireza. He recycles it into the game, covers the pawn, looking to come to f8. The queen came to d2 here, improving, overprotecting the bishop. Queen f8 played, and now bishop d1 opened up the attack of the rook, and so Alireza dropped back. He covered with rook f7, hands the move back to Deac, who is seriously short on time, really struggling. One of these knight moves would have been best to challenge that knight on c5, but he goes pawn b3, trying to stay solid, but now Alireza has a tactical shot. If you want to pause and look for it, please do so. It's the best move in the position, and if you're enjoying this video, do hit that like button and let me know, and consider subscribing to the channel to never miss a future video. So the best move here, the most tactical one anyway, to win a pawn is knight takes on h6. So the reason this works is that if white captures that one, then you can take on c3, you counter-attack on the queen, and now if the queen takes here, you then pick up on h6. This is a good endgame for black. Equally, if you try and capture this one, well then we take here, we can either recapture with the knight, we can take on e7. Again, it's a good endgame for black, not what white wants. So the capture on h6 didn't happen here. Instead, Deac took on c6 with 4 seconds to spare. The pawn recaptured, and now he had to go knight to a4 here. This was the best move, and the idea is you can't actually take this one, because then white does take on h6. There's no longer this bishop takes on c3 stuff. This is really good for white. Then you pick up the knight on the next move. So after this knight a4 move, you'd have to go knight g4, then you can chop on c5, you ruin the structure, really nice advantage for black. But Deac just couldn't calculate this, he didn't have the time, he went knight d4, but this is a blunder. Now you can immediately actually take that knight with the bishop. It doesn't look like you'd want to give up this wonderful bishop for knight, but then you get knight f5, black is a pawn ahead and consolidating. But what Alireza did was also a great move. He went knight to f5. Best here was capturing that knight, accepting being a little bit worse, a pawn down. But what Deac does is snap off on c6. He picks up that pawn, but this is bad because now bishop b7 comes, and not only are all of Alireza's pieces developing, but where is that knight actually going? It doesn't actually have any retreat squares here. This pawn covers b4. So it was defended with bishop f3, but now it was just simply attacked by the rook. Now best would have been rook c8 to attack it like that. Alireza went rook a6 instead, still a good move, and now there's not much Deac can do. He goes for a kamikaze, he takes on e7 with check. That one was captured by the knight. The bishop then took here on b7, but here Deac's just a straight piece down for a pawn. Alireza is winning. Now he doesn't immediately capture that one on b7. If he does this, then you can actually take here, the rook recaptures, bishop takes, queen takes, then knight d5, and the computer amazingly gives this position as roughly level, even though black's a piece ahead. So you don't want to let that knight land on d5, that would be big counterplay for white. So instead Alireza chucks in this takes on c3 first, the queen recaptured, then he picks up on b7, and this is a big improvement. So rook e2 played, looking to double on the file. Pawn h6, kick this bishop. Now coming back here is no good. Then you run into knight f5. So it came back to c1. Now we had rook a to a8 coming back into the game, and that's why rook c8 was a bit more accurate than rook a6 in that earlier position. And now bishop b2 was played, threatening mate in 1, so king h7, the queen covers the square, the rook doubled on the file, This knight came into c5 here, and now queen d2 was played. It's very difficult for Deac to actually turn the screw, apply more pressure, so he attacks that d6 pawn. It was defended with knight f5, and don't start throwing that g pawn, by the way, or then you're running into knight h4. That f3 square is now a massive problem. So after this knight f5 move, the queen came to d5 here. The pawn now came to h5, secures the knight, gives the king a bit of room in some variations, and now bishop c3 was played. A good move by Deac. He targets that a5 pawn, and knight d7 now from Alireza. So it's a nice idea he's got. He vacates that c5 square, he's swinging the knight around, and white could already take that pawn here, but instead rook e6 was played, just looking to invade, control more squares, control that knight from hopping to f6 for the moment. So Alireza goes rook to c8, he simply abandons the a5 pawn, and it is actually a great move if he finds the follow-up. So after the bishop captured there, which is what Deac played, he should have gone rook to c5. Now both players are incredibly low on time, they're playing on increment, but after rook c5, you force queen d2 to hold that bishop, and then knight e5 is the key trick. This is what Alireza missed. Now after knight e5, you've actually trapped in this rook. This is the problem for white. And say you go bishop c3, that's the best move on the board. Then queen c8 comes, you're hitting the rook, it's trapped in. Black's basically winning this position, should be able to convert. But Alireza missed this concept. He didn't put the rook on c5. Instead, he went knight f6, it hits the queen. But now after queen d2, Black's just not getting the same play, and white's got these really dangerous pawns now. If you gobble on d6 as well, then you'll have 3 connected passes. Suddenly the game's getting blown open. So Alireza went rook to e8, he challenges the file. We had the bishop recycling into the game, it came to c3. Alireza took on e6 here, the rook recaptured, and now he really had to go knight g7 here, just kick that rook out, whether it takes here or it retreats to e1, you just get rid of it, and then you can start looking at, say, knight g4 stuff. What Alireza did here was go knight d7, but the big problem with this is a very concrete move of queen to g5. And probably what Alireza missed from afar is that if he goes queen h6 to defend that pawn, well then white has the really sneaky move rook to e8. Now you're leaving your whole queen hanging, but if black takes that one, there's this beautiful mate in one using the bishop and rook. So that's absolutely no good. You can't take the queen. After this rook e8 move, you'd have to go, say, knight to e5, block out the bishop, but then you can take here, king recaptures, and this is a decent endgame for white. You can go pawn f4, pawn a4, etc. You know, not what Alireza wants here. So after this queen g5 move, he went queen to g8 instead. He defends the pawn, but it is a bit passive now, and pawn g4 was played, an excellent move, kicks the knight, threatens to rip open the king side, so capturing was forced, and the queen now recaptured. You could have even taken on d6 straight away. There was a tactical line there with a checkmate on the h-file, but after this queen now captures, there's still a lot of checks coming against the exposed king. It's not ideal for Alireza. He goes knight e5, trying to consolidate, hits the queen, trying to get black to give this bishop here, or white rather, to give the bishop, but instead we had a check. The knight blocked on h6, and now the rook picked up this d pawn. So white now has 3 connected passes. This is really anyone's game. It's gotten away from Alireza, even though he was the piece up. So queen e8 was played, coming to that file, looking to move the knight, create discovered tactics. The queen came to e6, and Alireza doesn't want to immediately get those ones off. You do have to be careful in these endgames. So he goes rook to e7, the queen gave ground, now he dropped this one back, hits the rook, it came into f6 here, and now rook d7 pressures that queen once again, so it came into e6, offering the trade, and this time it's unavoidable because there's so much pressure on the knight. So Alireza went rook d1 check, the king moved up, then he took on e6, the rook recaptured, and now this knight hit f5. So when the smoke has cleared here, we can see there's 3 pawns for the piece on the queen side. It should be a draw, but there's still a lot of tactics going on. These knights are hopping around. Both players are low on time once again. So rook e1 was now played. White wants to get those ones off, basically, stop this rook coming to the c-file behind the bishop and pawn. So Alireza ducked away, he went rook to d3. We had rook c1 to defend. The idea is to push the pawn. So the knight came to g5, and now this is a great move because if you play pawn c5, then there's knight e6. You hit the pawn, you threaten to come into f4. So if you carry on pushing, you can check like this, king f1, rook h3 swings across, and suddenly black is attacking, you're getting mated. You'd have to actually go king e1, but then there's knight d3. So you can't start pushing that c-pawn prematurely, basically. That's what this knight g5 move prevents. So the king came back to f1, recognizing those threats. Now knight e6 anyway, looks at c5, looks at f4. So bishop e5 covered. Now the rook came to d2, hits that second rank, and here actually Deac just abandoned that a pawn. Say you go pawn a4 trying to hold it, well then there's knight c5. You hit these pawns here, and not only that, say you go pawn b4, well knight d3 is coming. You hit rook, you hit bishop, you even hit f2. So you have to be so careful with these tricky knights, and that's why Deac didn't even bother with the a pawn. He just went b4, a good move. You give a2, but now you get c5. The pawns are really running here, but rook a4 now comes, pawn c6. Alireza picks up here, pawn c7. You have to give the knight, and this is Deac's point. You're just liquidating into a drawn endgame. So the king stepped back. We had a few more moves here. The rook shuffled back and forth. We had this one going along the 7th rank, and in this position here, a draw was agreed. So a very fighting game. Alireza just can't get going this tournament, unfortunately, but kudos to him for picking such an aggressive opening. So Wesley So is now winning the tournament after 5 rounds. Tomorrow is a break day, then we're back for 4 more rounds, which I'll be covering. Thanks very much for watching. If you want to see another classic game, then click here. See you soon.